The desert heat shimmered like liquid fire across the Afghan landscape as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her gear one final time. At 26, she had already served 3 tours of duty, but this mission felt different. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy combat pack she carried. Around her, the other soldiers from Charlie Company prepared their equipment with the methodical precision that comes from countless hours of training and the sharp awareness that their lives depended on every detail. Maria had always been smaller than most of her fellow soldiers. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a lean build, she often heard whispers about whether she could handle the same responsibilities as the men in her unit. But what she lacked in physical size, she made up for in determination, tactical intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to protecting her fellow soldiers. Her superiors had noticed these qualities, which is why she found herself preparing for one of the most dangerous missions of her military career. The briefing had been clear, but ominous. Intelligence reports indicated that a strategically important village had been overrun by insurgent forces. The enemy had established multiple defensive positions and were using the civilian population as human shields. Charlie Company's mission was to retake the village, secure the area, and evacuate any remaining civilians to safety. It was the kind of operation that could go wrong in 100 different ways, and everyone in the unit understood the risks involved. As Maria checked her M4 carbine and counted her ammunition, she couldn't shake the feeling that the standard equipment wouldn't be sufficient for what they were about to face. The intelligence reports mentioned heavily fortified positions and the possibility of prolonged firefights. Her tactical training told her that they would need sustained firepower to suppress enemy positions effectively while protecting the larger group during the evacuation process. That's when she made the decision that would later prove crucial to the mission's success. Maria approached her commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, with a request that surprised everyone within earshot. She wanted to carry the M249 squad automatic weapon instead of her standard rifle. The M249, known for its ability to lay down continuous suppressive fire, was typically assigned to soldiers specifically trained as automatic riflemen. It was heavier than standard infantry weapons, required more ammunition, and demanded exceptional physical endurance to operate effectively in combat conditions. Captain Rodriguez looked at Maria with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. The M249 weighed over 20 pounds when fully loaded, and that didn't include the additional weight of the extra ammunition required to keep it operational during extended engagements. Most soldiers found the weapon challenging to handle during long missions, and the captain had his doubts about whether Maria could manage its weight and recoil effectively while maintaining the mobility necessary for their urban combat mission. The reaction from her fellow soldiers was immediate and unmistakable. Some laughed outright, while others exchanged glances that clearly communicated their doubts about her judgment. Sergeant Thompson, a veteran with multiple deployments, shook his head and commented that the M249 wasn't a toy and that she should stick with equipment more suited to her size. Private Johnson suggested that she was trying to prove something unnecessarily and that it might put the entire unit at risk if she couldn't handle the weapon effectively when it mattered most. Even some of the soldiers who respected Maria's abilities expressed concerns about her decision. Corporal Williams, who had served alongside her on previous missions, pulled her aside to question whether she was making an emotional decision rather than a tactical one. He reminded her that carrying the M249 would slow her down and limit her mobility, 2 factors that had always been among her greatest strengths in combat situations. But Maria had done her homework. She had studied the mission parameters carefully and analyzed the tactical challenges they were likely to face. The village layout, with its narrow streets and multi-story buildings, would create numerous opportunities for ambushes and crossfires. The enemy would have had time to prepare defensive positions, and breaking through those positions would require sustained automatic fire to keep the insurgents' heads down, while the rest of the unit maneuvered into better positions. She also understood something that her critics didn't fully appreciate. While the M249 was undeniably heavy and physically demanding, her years of intensive physical training had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge. She had spent countless hours in the gym and on training courses, building not just muscle, Strength, but also the kind of endurance necessary to operate effectively under extreme physical stress. More importantly, she had spent time familiarizing herself with the M249 during training exercises, learning its characteristics and capabilities. Despite the skepticism and outright mockery from some of her fellow soldiers, Maria remained confident in her decision. She knew that military success often came down to having the right tool for the specific job at hand, and her tactical analysis told her that the M249 would be that tool for this particular mission. She also knew that proving herself meant more than just completing the mission successfully. It meant demonstrating that leadership and tactical intelligence mattered more than physical stereotypes. Captain Rodriguez finally agreed to let her carry the M249. Though his approval came with visible reluctance and a stern warning about the responsibilities that came with the weapon, he made it clear that if her choice compromised the mission or put other soldiers at risk, she would face serious consequences. The weight of that responsibility was something Maria accepted without hesitation, understanding that she was betting her career and her reputation on her ability to prove that her tactical judgment was sound. As the unit made final preparations for departure, Maria could feel the eyes of her fellow soldiers on her. Some watched with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism, and a few with the kind of concern that comes from knowing that everyone's life might depend on whether she had made the right choice. The M249 felt heavy in her hands, but it also felt like the key to ensuring that everyone in Charlie Company would make it home safely from what promised to be one of the most dangerous missions any of them had ever undertaken. The convoy of armored vehicles moved through the pre-dawn darkness like mechanical predators stalking their prey. Maria sat in the back of the lead Humvee, the M249 resting across her lap, its weight a constant reminder of the choice she had made and the doubts it had generated among her fellow soldiers. The desert air was still cool at this hour, but everyone knew that within a few hours the temperature would climb to levels that made every piece of equipment feel twice as heavy and every decision twice as critical. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through their radio headsets as he provided final updates on the tactical situation. Drone surveillance had confirmed that the insurgents had indeed fortified the village extensively. They had created firing positions on rooftops, barricaded several key intersections, and were using the local mosque and school as command posts, knowing that American forces would be reluctant to target those structures directly. The enemy had also demonstrated their willingness to use civilians as human shields, which meant that every engagement would require extreme precision and careful consideration of collateral damage. As they approached the village outskirts, Maria found herself reviewing everything she knew about urban combat tactics. The narrow streets would channel their movement and create natural kill zones where the enemy could concentrate their fire. The multi-story buildings would provide elevated positions for snipers and machine gun teams. Most challenging of all, the presence of civilians meant that they couldn't simply overwhelm enemy positions with superior firepower. They would need to use surgical precision while maintaining enough suppressive fire to protect their own advancing forces. The first phase of the mission called for Charlie Company to establish a perimeter around the village, while Alpha and Bravo companies approached from different directions. This coordinated approach was designed to prevent the insurgents from concentrating their forces against any single point of attack, but it also meant that each company would be operating with reduced numbers and would need to be largely self-sufficient. Once the fighting began, Maria's squad was assigned to secure the eastern approach, which intelligence reports indicated was one of the most heavily defended areas. The enemy had constructed a series of overlapping firing positions that would allow them to engage any approaching force with crossfire from multiple directions. Breaking through those positions would require someone to provide sustained, suppressive fire, while the rest of the squad maneuvered to neutralize the threats one by one. As they dismounted from their vehicles and began their approach on foot, Maria could feel the familiar mixture of anxiety and focused determination that preceded combat operations. Her heart rate increased, but her breathing remained controlled and steady. The M249 felt natural in her hands now, and she had distributed the additional ammunition among her gear in a way that balanced weight distribution while ensuring quick access when needed. The village appeared deceptively quiet as they approached the first cluster of buildings. The early morning light cast long shadows between the structures, creating a patchwork of concealment and exposure that both sides would try to exploit. Maria's tactical training told her that the silence was deceptive. The enemy was certainly aware of their approach, and was likely waiting for them to move into predetermined kill zones before opening fire. Sergeant Thompson, who had been among the most vocal critics of Maria's weapon choice, was leading the squad's advance element. Despite his earlier skepticism about her decision, he was a professional soldier who understood that personal disagreements had no place in combat situations. He used hand signals to communicate their movement plan, indicating that Maria would provide overwatch and suppressive fire, while the rest of the squad bounded forward in teams. The first contact came without warning, as enemy contacts always did. A sniper's bullet cracked past Sergeant Thompson's head, missing by inches and sending fragments of concrete flying from the wall behind him. Almost instantly, automatic weapons fire erupted from at least 3 different positions, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned the advance element behind inadequate cover. This was the moment Maria had prepared for, the situation her tactical analysis had predicted. While her fellow soldiers found themselves trapped behind a low wall with limited options for movement, she quickly identified the firing positions and began calculating angles of approach for effective suppressive fire. The M249's bipod deployed smoothly as she established a stable firing position behind a concrete barrier that provided both protection and a clear field of fire. Her first burst was carefully aimed at the nearest machine gun position, a sandbagged emplacement on a second-story balcony. The sustained fire forced the enemy gunners to take cover, immediately reducing the incoming fire that had been keeping her squad pinned down. But Maria knew that suppressive fire was only effective if it was maintained consistently, and that meant managing her ammunition carefully while keeping enough pressure on the enemy positions to allow her teammates to maneuver. The M249's rate of fire and sustained capability quickly proved its worth in the urban environment. While a standard rifle would have required frequent reloading and couldn't maintain the volume of fire necessary to keep multiple enemy positions suppressed simultaneously, the squad automatic weapon allowed Maria to engage targets continuously, while her fellow soldiers bounded from cover to cover, closing the distance to the enemy positions. Sergeant Thompson, despite his initial skepticism about Maria's weapon choice, quickly recognized the tactical advantage she was providing. Using hand signals, he coordinated the squad's movement to take advantage of the suppressive fire she was laying down. Private Johnson and Corporal Williams moved together toward the left flank, while Thompson and 2 other soldiers approached from the right, using Maria's fire to mask their movement and force the enemy to keep their heads down. The engagement lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Maria providing almost continuous suppressive fire, while her squad mates systematically eliminated the enemy positions. The M249's sustained fire capability allowed her to engage multiple targets in sequence, switching between positions as tactical requirements changed, and always maintaining enough pressure to prevent the enemy from effectively returning fire. When the immediate threat had been neutralized, the squad regrouped to assess the situation and plan their next move. Several of the soldiers who had questioned Maria's decision earlier now looked at her with a new level of respect. The tactical advantage provided by the M249 had been undeniable, and its effectiveness in the urban environment had exceeded even Maria's expectations. But this was only the beginning of their mission, and everyone understood that the most dangerous phase was still ahead of them. The gunfire had undoubtedly alerted every insurgent in the village to their presence, and the enemy would now be repositioning forces and preparing for a coordinated defense. The real test of Maria's tactical judgment and the weapon she had chosen to carry was yet to come. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets as Charlie Company pushed deeper into the village. What had started as a coordinated 3-pronged assault was quickly becoming a series of individual firefights as the enemy's defensive strategy became clear. The insurgents weren't trying to hold fixed positions. Instead, they were using hit-and-run tactics, forcing the American forces to clear each building methodically while constantly watching for ambushes from structures they had already secured. Maria's squad found themselves at the center of the most intense fighting. The eastern approach, which intelligence had identified as heavily defended, was proving to be even more challenging than expected. The enemy had prepared multiple fallback positions, each one designed to channel the advancing American forces into carefully prepared kill zones. Every intersection presented a potential ambush, every rooftop a possible sniper's nest, and every doorway a place where insurgents might be waiting with automatic weapons or improvised explosive devices. The M249 had already proven its worth in the initial engagement, but Maria knew that the real test was just beginning. Urban warfare demanded not just firepower, but also tactical flexibility and the ability to adapt quickly to changing situations. The weapon she carried was powerful, but it was also demanding, both physically and tactically. Every burst of fire had to be precisely aimed to avoid civilian casualties, and every movement had to account for the additional weight and bulk of the squad automatic weapon. As they approached the village's main marketplace, Captain Rodriguez's voice came through their radio headsets with an urgency that made everyone's blood run cold. Alpha Company had encountered heavy resistance and was pinned down near the mosque. They had taken casualties and were requesting immediate support. At the same time, Bravo Company reported that they had located a group of civilians trapped in a school building but couldn't reach them due to sustained enemy fire from surrounding buildings. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What should have been a coordinated operation was becoming a desperate battle for survival, with American forces scattered throughout the village and facing an enemy that knew the terrain intimately and had prepared for exactly this kind of engagement. The original mission parameters were no longer relevant. Now it was about getting everyone home alive while completing as much of their objective as possible. Maria's squad received orders to move toward Alpha Company's position and provide support. But reaching them would require crossing nearly 200 meters of open ground that was covered by at least 3 enemy machine gun positions. The marketplace, which during peacetime would have been filled with vendors and customers, was now a deadly expanse where any movement would draw immediate and concentrated fire. This was exactly the kind of tactical challenge that Maria had anticipated when she requested the M249. Standard rifles, even in the hands of excellent marksmen, couldn't provide the sustained suppressive fire necessary to allow a squad to cross open ground under enemy observation, but the squad automatic weapon could lay down enough continuous fire to force the enemy to take cover and limit their ability to engage moving targets effectively. Sergeant Thompson quickly grasped the tactical requirements of the situation. Despite his initial doubts about Maria's weapon choice, he now found himself depending on her ability to provide the firepower that would keep his entire squad alive. Using the radio, he coordinated with the other squad leaders to synchronize their movement with Maria's suppressive fire, ensuring that they could bound across the dangerous open ground in stages while maintaining mutual support. The plan was simple but dangerous. Maria would establish a firing position that provided overlapping fields of fire across the marketplace, while the rest of the squad moved in teams of 2, using whatever cover was available to cross the open ground in short rushes. The success of the entire operation would depend on her ability to identify and suppress enemy positions quickly enough to prevent them from engaging the moving soldiers effectively. As Maria prepared to begin the suppressive fire sequence, she could feel the weight of responsibility that went beyond just her own survival. 9 other soldiers would be depending on her tactical judgment and her ability to operate the M249 effectively under extreme stress. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and her fellow soldiers could pay with their lives. The weapon that some had mocked as too much for her to handle was now the key to everyone's survival. The first burst from the M249 was aimed at a second-story window where muzzle flashes had indicated an enemy machine gun position. The sustained fire forced the insurgents to take cover, immediately reducing the volume of incoming fire across the marketplace. But Maria knew that suppressive fire was only effective if it was maintained consistently and adjusted constantly as new threats emerged. Moving with practiced efficiency, she shifted her fire to a rooftop position where movement had indicated the presence of enemy fighters. The M249's sustained fire capability allowed her to keep continuous pressure on multiple positions while her squad mates began their dangerous sprint across the open ground. Each burst was carefully controlled to maximize suppressive effect while conserving ammunition for the prolonged engagement she knew was coming. Private Johnson and Corporal Williams made the first bound, covering nearly 50 meters before taking cover behind an overturned market stall. Their movement drew immediate fire from at least two positions that Maria hadn't previously identified, but the M249's rapid response capability allowed her to shift fire quickly and force the newly revealed enemies to take cover. The urban environment created acoustic challenges that made it difficult to pinpoint enemy positions precisely, but Maria had trained for exactly these conditions. She used the muzzle flashes and the sound signatures of different weapons to identify threats quickly and engage them before they could effectively target her moving squadmates. The M249's sustained fire capability was proving invaluable in creating the kind of suppressive umbrella that allowed tactical movement under fire. As more of her squadmates made their bounds across the marketplace, Maria found herself engaging an increasing number of enemy positions. The insurgents were trying to mass their fire to stop the American advance, but the sustained suppressive fire from the M249 was disrupting their coordination and forcing them to focus on survival rather than effective targeting. The physical demands of operating the M249 under these conditions were enormous. The weapon's recoil, combined with the need to maintain precise control while engaging multiple targets rapidly, required every ounce of strength and training that Maria possessed. But her months of preparation were paying off. She was able to maintain effective fire while managing the weapon's demands and coordinating with her squadmates' movement. By the time the last members of her squad had crossed the marketplace safely, Maria had expended nearly half of her ammunition and engaged more than a dozen enemy positions. The M249 had performed exactly as she had hoped, providing the sustained suppressive fire necessary to allow her entire squad to cross dangerous open ground without taking a single casualty. But the mission was far from over, and the most dangerous phase was still ahead of them. The rendezvous with Alpha Company revealed the true scope of the tactical disaster that was unfolding. Captain Martinez, Alpha's commanding officer, had been wounded in the initial assault and was being treated by the unit's medic behind an improvised barricade of concrete blocks and overturned vehicles. 3 other soldiers had been hit, and the entire company was effectively pinned down by a coordinated enemy defense that had turned the area around the mosque into a deadly maze of crossfire and ambush positions. Maria's squad arrived to find Alpha Company spread across multiple positions, unable to advance or withdraw safely due to the overlapping fields of fire that the insurgents had established. The enemy had clearly anticipated the American assault and had prepared their defensive positions with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training. Every approach to their positions was covered by multiple weapons, and they had demonstrated their willingness to use rocket-propelled grenades against any concentrated American forces. The tactical situation was complicated further by the presence of civilians. Drone surveillance had confirmed that women and children were being held in the mosque itself, while other non-combatants were trapped in nearby buildings. Any attempt to use overwhelming firepower against the enemy positions would inevitably result in civilian casualties, which meant that the American forces had to rely on precision and tactical superiority rather than their usual advantages in firepower and technology. Captain Rodriguez quickly assessed the situation and began coordinating a combined assault using both companies. The plan required careful timing and exceptional individual performance from key soldiers, particularly those responsible for providing suppressive fire during the most dangerous phases of the operation. Once again, all eyes turned to Maria and the M249 that had already proven its worth during the approach to this position. The enemy's defensive strategy was becoming clear as the American forces studied their positions. The insurgents had established a series of mutually supporting strongpoints that covered all the obvious approaches to the mosque. Each position was designed to provide covering fire for the others, creating a defensive network that would be extremely difficult to break without suffering heavy casualties. The key to success would be identifying and neutralizing the central command position that was coordinating the enemy's defensive fire. Intelligence from the drone surveillance suggested that the primary enemy command post was located in a 3-story building adjacent to the mosque. This position not only provided excellent observation in fields of fire, but also allowed the enemy commander to coordinate the defensive actions of all the surrounding positions. Taking out this command post would disrupt the enemy's coordination and create opportunities for the American forces to exploit gaps in their defensive network. But reaching the building would require crossing nearly 300 meters of terrain that was completely dominated by enemy fire. The approach would have to be made in stages, with different elements of the combined force providing mutual support while advancing under the cover of sustained suppressive fire. The success of the entire operation would depend on the ability of the suppressive fire teams to keep the enemy's heads down long enough for assault elements to close with and destroy their positions. Maria found herself assigned to the primary, suppressive fire team, along with 2 other soldiers carrying M249s and a designated marksman with an enhanced M14 rifle. Their position would provide overwatch for the entire assault, engaging any enemy positions that threatened the advancing American forces. It was a role that required not just accurate marksmanship, but also tactical awareness and the ability to coordinate with multiple moving elements simultaneously. As she prepared her firing position, Maria reviewed the intelligence reports one more time and studied the terrain carefully. The M249's effective range and sustained fire capability would allow her to engage targets at distances that were beyond the effective range of most of the enemy's weapons. But the urban environment created numerous opportunities for concealment and covered approaches that the insurgents could exploit. The assault began with a coordinated artillery barrage designed to suppress the enemy positions without causing structural damage to the buildings where civilians were known to be located. The precision strikes were followed immediately by smoke grenades that created a visual barrier to mask the initial movement of the assault teams. But everyone understood that once the smoke cleared, the success of the operation would depend entirely on the skills and equipment of the individual soldiers involved. Maria's first targets were the machine gun positions that posed the greatest threat to the advancing assault teams. The M249's sustained fire capability allowed her to engage these positions continuously, forcing the enemy gunners to take cover and limiting their ability to engage the moving American forces effectively. But urban combat created unique challenges for automatic weapons, as the sound of gunfire echoed between buildings in ways that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location of both friendly and enemy forces. As the assault teams began their advance, Maria found herself engaging targets at an unprecedented rate. The enemy's defensive strategy relied on mutually supporting positions, which meant that suppressing one position often revealed others that had previously been concealed. The M249's rapid target engagement capability proved invaluable in these conditions, allowing her to shift between multiple threats quickly while maintaining enough sustained fire on each to prevent effective return fire. The physical and mental demands of the engagement were unlike anything Maria had experienced in her previous deployments. Operating the M249 effectively required not just physical strength and endurance, but also the kind of tactical awareness that allowed her to track multiple moving elements simultaneously while engaging an ever-changing array of targets. The weapon's sustained fire capability was exactly what the tactical situation required, but exploiting that capability demanded every ounce of training and preparation she had accumulated over her years of service. Private Johnson, who had been among the skeptics questioning Maria's weapon choice, found himself advancing under the protective umbrella of her suppressive fire. As he moved from cover to cover, he began to understand the tactical advantage that the M249 provided in urban combat situations. The sustained fire was not just keeping the enemy's heads down, it was also disrupting their communication and coordination, making it impossible for them to mass their fire effectively against any single target. The assault teams made steady progress toward their objectives, but the enemy's resistance was fiercer than anyone had anticipated. The insurgents demonstrated tactical discipline and professional military training that suggested they were not simply local fighters, but experienced combatants who understood how to exploit urban terrain for maximum defensive advantage. Every building had to be cleared methodically, and every intersection presented potential ambush sites that required careful reconnaissance and suppressive fire. As the operation continued, Maria's ammunition supply began to run low, but the tactical, situation prevented any opportunity for resupply. She began calculating her remaining ammunition against the expected duration of the engagement, making difficult decisions about when to engage targets and when to conserve her remaining rounds for the most critical moments of the assault. The awaken M249 had proven its worth beyond any doubt, but now she would have to demonstrate her tactical judgment in managing her most valuable resource under extreme pressure. The decisive moment came when the enemy launched their counterattack. Intelligence reports had suggested that the insurgents might have reinforcements in the area, but no one had anticipated the coordinated assault that emerged from multiple directions simultaneously. Enemy fighters appeared on rooftops, in doorways, and from concealed positions throughout the village, creating a three-dimensional battlefield where threats could emerge from any direction at any time. Maria's position, which had provided excellent overwatch during the advance phase of the operation, suddenly became the focal point of intense enemy fire. The insurgents had clearly identified the suppressive fire positions as key targets, and they were concentrating their efforts on neutralizing the weapons that had been disrupting their defensive coordination. Bullets cracked past her position, with increasing frequency, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of rocket-propelled grenades being fired in her direction. But this was exactly the kind of situation for which Maria had trained throughout her military career. While other soldiers might have been overwhelmed by the intensity of the incoming fire, she remained focused on the tactical requirements of the situation. The assault teams were still exposed and vulnerable, and any reduction in suppressive fire would give the enemy the opportunity to mass their fire against the advancing American forces. The M249 was no longer just a tactical advantage. It had become the key to survival for dozens of American soldiers. The weapon's sustained fire capability allowed Maria to engage multiple enemy positions in rapid succession while maintaining enough continuous fire on each to prevent effective return fire. But ammunition management had become critical. With less than 200 rounds remaining, every burst had to be precisely aimed and tactically justified. There was no room for suppressive fire that wasn't directly contributing to the success of the mission and the survival of her fellow soldiers. The enemy's counterattack was coordinated and professional, suggesting that they had been planning this response from the beginning of the engagement. Rather than simply trying to hold their positions, they were attempting to surround and destroy the American forces piece by piece. The tactical situation was becoming desperate, with multiple American units calling for immediate support and reporting casualties from the intensified enemy fire. Maria's radio crackled with urgent requests for suppressive fire from various positions throughout the battlefield. Sergeant Thompson's voice was among them, requesting immediate fire on a machine gun position that was preventing his team from reaching wounded soldiers who were trapped in the open. At the same time, Captain Rodriguez was coordinating a withdrawal of the most exposed positions, but the movement would require sustained covering fire to prevent the enemy from massacring the retreating soldiers. This was the moment when years of training and tactical preparation converged with the split-second decision-making that defined combat leadership. Maria had to prioritize targets based not just on their immediate threat, but also on their strategic importance to the overall success of the mission. Every burst from the M249 had to count, because there might not be enough ammunition for a second chance at any particular target. Her first priority was the machine gun position that was threatening Sergeant Thompson's rescue attempt. The sustained fire from the M249 forced the enemy gunners to take cover, creating a brief window of opportunity for Thompson's team to reach their wounded comrades and drag them to safety. But engaging that target revealed her position more clearly to other enemy fighters, who immediately began concentrating their fire on her location. The tactical situation required constant movement and repositioning to avoid becoming a stationary target for enemy fire, but the M249's weight made rapid movement challenging. Maria found herself making calculated decisions about when to move and when to maintain her position, based on the immediate tactical requirements and the amount of cover available. Every decision carried life or death consequences, not just for herself, but for the soldiers who were depending on her suppressive fire for their survival. As the enemy counterattack intensified, Maria found herself engaging targets at the absolute limits of the M249's effective range. Enemy fighters on distant rooftops were attempting to coordinate their fire against the American positions, but the sustained automatic fire was disrupting their communication and forcing them to focus on survival rather than tactical coordination. The weapon's capability to engage multiple targets across a wide area was proving invaluable in the three-dimensional urban battlefield. The physical demands of the prolonged engagement were beginning to take their toll. Operating the M249 effectively under these conditions required not just physical strength, but also the kind of sustained concentration that was difficult to maintain under extreme stress. The weapon's recoil, combined with the need for precise target acquisition and ammunition management, demanded every ounce of training and experience that Maria had accumulated throughout her military career. But the tactical effectiveness of her suppressive fire was undeniable. Across the battlefield, American forces were successfully completing their missions under the protective umbrella of sustained automatic fire. The wounded were being evacuated, defensive positions were being consolidated, and the enemy's coordinated assault was being disrupted by the sustained pressure that prevented effective tactical coordination. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with new orders that would require the most challenging target engagement of the entire mission. A group of civilians, including women and children, had been identified in a building that was surrounded by enemy fighters. The rescue operation would require precise suppressive fire that kept the insurgents pinned down without risking civilian casualties from stray rounds or ricochets. This was the ultimate test of both Maria's marksmanship skills and her tactical judgment. The M249's sustained fire capability would be essential for keeping the enemy suppressed during the rescue operation, but every round would have to be placed with surgical precision to avoid any possibility of civilian casualties. The margin for error was zero, and the consequences of any mistake would be measured in innocent lives. As Maria prepared for what would be the most critical engagement of her military career, she could feel the weight of responsibility that went far beyond her own survival, or even the success of the mission. The weapon that had been mocked as too much for her to handle was now the key to saving civilian lives and ensuring that her fellow soldiers could complete their most important objective. Everything she had trained for, everything she had prepared for had led to this moment when tactical excellence would determine who lived and who died in the narrow streets of an Afghan village. The final phase of the mission unfolded with the precision of a surgical operation, but with stakes that were measured in human lives rather than medical outcomes. Maria positioned herself to provide overwatch for the civilian rescue operation, knowing that her remaining ammunition would have to last through the most challenging target engagement of her career. The building where the civilians were trapped was surrounded by at least 6 enemy positions, each one carefully positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire that would make any rescue attempt nearly impossible without sustained and precisely placed suppressive fire. The rescue team consisted of 8 soldiers led by Corporal Williams, who had initially questioned Maria's decision to carry the M249, but now found himself depending entirely on her ability to keep the enemy suppressed during the most dangerous phase of the operation. The plan required the rescue team to cross approximately 100 meters of open ground, breach the building, evacuate the civilians, and return to safety, all while under direct observation and fire from multiple enemy positions. Maria's tactical analysis of the enemy positions revealed the complexity of the challenge she faced. The insurgents had positioned their fighters to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach to the building. Suppressing one position would only be effective if the others were also kept under continuous pressure, which meant that the M249's sustained fire capability would be tested to its absolute limits. With fewer than 100 rounds remaining, every burst would have to be perfectly timed and precisely aimed. The civilian rescue operation began with Maria engaging the 2 machine gun positions that posed the greatest threat to the approaching rescue team. Her first burst forced the enemy gunners to take cover, but she could see muzzle flashes from other positions as the insurgents attempted to shift their fire to compensate for the suppressed weapons. The M249's rapid target transition capability allowed her to engage the newly active positions quickly, but each engagement consumed precious ammunition that couldn't be replaced. As Corporal Williams led his team across the open ground, Maria found herself engaging targets in a sequence that required split-second timing and perfect tactical judgment. The enemy fighters were attempting to coordinate their fire against the moving rescue team, but the sustained pressure from the M249 was disrupting their communication and forcing them to focus on individual survival rather than tactical coordination. Every burst from her weapon created a brief window of opportunity that the rescue team exploited with professional precision. The breach of the building went according to plan, with the rescue team successfully reaching the structure and beginning the process of evacuating the trapped civilians. But Maria could see enemy fighters attempting to reposition themselves to engage the rescue team during their withdrawal, which would be the most vulnerable phase of the operation. The civilians would slow the team's movement and make them easy targets for coordinated enemy fire, unless she could maintain continuous suppression of the repositioning fighters. With less than 50 rounds remaining, Maria made the tactical decision that would define the success or failure of the entire operation. Rather than conserving ammunition for potential future threats, she committed her remaining firepower to ensuring the successful evacuation of the civilians and the safe return of the rescue team. The M249's sustained fire capability would be pushed to its absolute limits, but the alternative was accepting casualties among both American soldiers and innocent civilians. The withdrawal began with Corporal Williams carrying a wounded civilian child while his team provided security for the other evacuees. Maria could see enemy fighters moving through the buildings, attempting to reach positions where they could engage the slow-moving group with devastating effect. Her response was immediate and decisive. Sustained bursts from the M249 that forced the repositioning enemies to take cover and abandon their attempts to reach advantageous firing positions. But the enemy's desperation was becoming apparent, as they realized that their opportunity to inflict casualties on the American forces was rapidly disappearing. The insurgent fighters began taking increasingly dangerous risks, exposing themselves to Maria's fire in attempts to reach positions where they could engage the rescue team effectively. This created a deadly game of tactical chess, with Maria using her remaining ammunition to anticipate and counter every enemy movement. The most critical moment came when an enemy fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher appeared on a rooftop that provided a clear line of sight to the evacuation route. The weapon posed a catastrophic threat to the entire rescue team and the civilians they were protecting. Maria had fewer than 20 rounds remaining, but the tactical situation left no room for ammunition conservation. Her sustained burst forced the enemy fighter to take cover just as he was preparing to fire, causing the rocket-propelled grenade to detonate harmlessly against the building's facade. As the rescue team reached the halfway point of their withdrawal, Maria's ammunition counter showed fewer than 10 rounds remaining. The enemy fighters seemed to sense that the suppressive fire was weakening, and they began making increasingly bold attempts to engage the vulnerable evacuation group. But Maria had saved her final rounds for exactly this situation. The moment when tactical precision mattered more than sustained fire. Her last engagement was a masterpiece of marksmanship and tactical judgment. With only 5 rounds remaining, she identified the enemy fighter who posed the greatest threat to the evacuation, a sniper who had positioned himself to engage the rescue team during their final approach to safety. Her single, precisely aimed, burst eliminated the threat and expended her final ammunition, just as Corporal Williams and his team reached the safety of the American perimeter. The silence that followed the end of Maria's suppressive fire was filled with the sound of American soldiers calling out positions and confirming the safety of the rescued civilians. The mission that had begun with skepticism about her weapon choice had ended with the successful evacuation of 12 civilians and the safe return of all American personnel. The M249 that some had mocked as too much weapon for her to handle had provided the sustained suppressive fire that made the difference between mission success and potential catastrophe. In the aftermath of the operation, as Charlie Company regrouped and prepared for extraction, the attitude toward Maria had changed completely. Sergeant Thompson, who had been among the most vocal critics of her decision to carry the M249, approached her with a look of genuine respect and gratitude. He acknowledged that her tactical judgment had been correct, and that her weapon choice had likely saved lives throughout the operation. The sustained fire capability of the M249 had proven essential in the urban combat environment, and her ability to operate the weapon effectively under extreme conditions had exceeded everyone's expectations. Captain Rodriguez later wrote in his after-action report that Staff Sergeant Santos's decision to carry the M249 had been instrumental in the mission's success. Her tactical analysis of the operational requirements had been accurate, and her performance with the weapon had demonstrated the highest levels of professional competence and personal courage. The suppressive fire she provided had enabled the AI's successful completion of multiple complex tactical operations while minimizing casualties among both American forces and civilian populations. The story of Maria's performance with the M249 spread throughout the battalion and eventually became a case study in tactical decision-making and the importance of matching weapons to mission requirements rather than traditional assumptions about soldier capabilities. Her request for the heavy automatic weapon, which had initially been met with mockery and skepticism, had ultimately proven to be the key factor in protecting over 100 American soldiers and saving the lives of innocent civilians. Years later, when Maria reflected on that day in the Afghan village, she understood that the mission had been about more than just tactical success or personal vindication. It had demonstrated that military effectiveness came from tactical intelligence, thorough preparation, and the courage to make difficult decisions based on professional analysis rather than conventional assumptions. The M249 had been the right tool for that specific mission, and her ability to use it effectively had been the result of years of training and preparation for exactly the kind of challenges they had faced. The weapon that had been mocked as too much for her to handle had ultimately become the instrument through which she proved that tactical excellence knew no boundaries of size or gender, only the boundaries of training, preparation, and the courage to make the right decisions under the most extreme pressure imaginable.